Hello friends, if you want to watch super hit movie Rampage in English, then you must like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Friends, in today's video, the movie we're going to talk about is called Rampage. We will talk about what this movie is and where you can watch it, all the interesting facts about this movie in today's video. I'm going to tell you, I'm also going to give you all the information on which OTT platform or on which satellite channel you will get to watch this movie. Also, we will talk in detail about the technical department, music department, pre-production, filming, post-production, budget, box office collection of this film. We will also talk about the story of this film, and I will also give you a small review of the story of this film. Apart from this, we will discuss about the facts of this film's storyline, Starcast actors' performance in the film, and which character has played which role. That's why I request you friends to watch this video till the end, so let's start the video. Dwayne Johnson finally gets a star to match his size, if not charisma, in the sometimes gloriously ludicrous Rampage, a movie based on a hit arcade game that was literally just larger-than-life monsters bashing buildings. If you're thinking, wow, that seems like a flimsy premise from which to adapt a feature film, you're not entirely wrong. Directed by San Andreas Helmer Brad Peyton, this CGI blockbuster is often a defiantly stupid movie, most comfortable with what it's trying to accomplish when giant monsters are destroying half of downtown Chicago or leaping on moving helicopters. It's the narrative tissue in between that allows the movie magic to falter every now and then. However, when Johnson is doing that movie action star thing he does so well, and giant animals are going enormous mano, there's undeniably goofy fun to be had. You just have to be patient during the downtime. Rampage opens by establishing its ridiculous tone early. A scientist on a space station is struggling to save some genetically engineered samples from, well, a mutated super rat. The station is on fire and everyone else appears dead, but she's ordered to save the science. Yes, Rampage opens with a super space rat aboard an on-fire spaceship hurtling to Earth. It's certainly a tone setter. The samples plummet to Earth and land in 3 locations. One happens to hit ground in a San Diego wildlife sanctuary managed by Davis Okoye Johnson. Davis's favorite beast is a giant albino gorilla named George, and the clever animal happens upon one of the genetic samples. Before you know it, George is growing at a never-before-seen rate, accompanied by increased aggression and insatiable hunger. He kills a bear, escapes, and, well, lots of things go boom. That's why you come to a movie like Rampage, to see and hear things go boom. A critical caveat seems appropriate here. I dig giant monster movies. I still awe at the 1933 King Kong, a movie that I consider among the most important ever made. I even dug Peter Jackson's 2005 remake, as well as recent iterations of The King of the Monsters, both in Gareth Edwards' 2014 American version, Godzilla, and Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi's 2016 Japanese version, Shin Godzilla. There's something about the spectacle of movies like King Kong and Godzilla that's singularly cinematic. It's not something that other forms like theater, TV, or fiction can do in quite the same way. Add this appreciation for big creatures slamming into buildings with my belief that Dwayne Johnson is one of the few current working actors we can legitimately call a movie star, and Rampage should be a slam dunk. I even played the arcade game. So why isn't it a slam dunk? Sure, there are times when Rampage gives viewers exactly what they were hoping for when they opened their wallets or whipped out their movie pass. No one can really accuse this movie of not delivering on what was in the trailers, although one could argue the whole movie is in those trailers. So why isn't it the King Kong meets the Rock it could have been? First, the film seriously muddles its vague attempts at emotional undercurrents. Davis mentions early on that he likes the company of animals more than people, but to say he has no actual character would be an understatement. George is actually more developed. And Naomie Harris' eventual sidekick Kate has an emotional backstory that's designed to make her more accessible, but really just falls flat. A scene between the two when they share their pasts, including when Davis found George and saved him from poachers, is embarrassingly mishandled. But nothing sinks the film more than Jake Lacy and Malin Åkerman's villains, the nefarious siblings who run the evil company doing evil science things and making evil big animals and more evil stuff. They sometimes sound like they were written as over-the-top caricatures, Lacy's Brett actually says, "There's a reason we were doing these experiments in space, but the characters' performances are so bland that the movie sags every time they show up." More fun are Joe Manganiello's Soldier of Fortune and Jeffrey Dean Morgan's OG, Other Government Agency Officer. Morgan delivers every line with a cocked neck and southern side-eye that hints he knows how goofy this whole thing truly is, or at least should be. Morgan's having fun for sure, and Johnson is charismatic, but Peyton too often struggles to convey that big monster movie sense of excitement cinematically. Even when Rampage gets to the fireworks, it feels like it's too often going through the motions. There are just enough big beats. A giant wolf leaping at a mid-air helicopter, George using tanks like toys on Michigan Avenue, all the animals climbing the will always be known as to me Sears Tower to keep fans engaged. But monster movies should do more than just keep you engaged. They should wow. They should fascinate. They should strike the imagination in such a way that they allow things like cheesy dialogue and thin characters to not only be critically dismissible, but downright preferable. Rampage never quite gets to that point where you can consistently ignore the things it does wrong, and that can be deadly for a movie about animals the size of apartment buildings. It's a tonal balance that Rampage only sometimes hits. Maybe they'll perfect it in time for Dig Dug. Rampage is a 2018 American science fiction monster film directed by Brad Peyton and loosely based on the video game series of the same name by Midway Games, from a screenplay by Ryan Engle, Carlton Cuse, Ryan J. Condal, and Adam Stekiel. The film stars Dwayne Johnson in the lead role, Naomie Harris, Malin Åkerman, Jake Lacy, Joe Manganiello, and Jeffrey Dean Morgan. It follows a primatologist who, along with his leucistic western lowland gorilla friend that has become a raging creature with fluctuating size enhancements as a result of a rogue experiment, must stop two other mutated animals. The film is the third collaboration between Peyton and Johnson, following Journey to The Mysterious Island, 2012, and San Andreas, 2015. Principal photography began in April 2017 in Chicago. The film was released in the United States on April 13, 2018 by Warner Brothers Pictures. The film grossed over $428 million worldwide and received mixed reviews from critics, with praise for its performances, particularly Johnson and Morgan, action sequences, and visual effects, but criticism of its screenplay, pacing, and storyline. Plot: Athena 1, a space station owned by nefarious gene manipulation company Energene, is destroyed after a laboratory rat mutates and wreaks havoc. Carrie Atkins, the lone surviving crew member, manages to escape in the escape pod when the station implodes, along with a trio of pathogen canisters that Energene CEO Claire Wyden ordered her to retrieve. But the pod disintegrates upon re-entry, killing her and leaving a trail of debris across the United States. One canister is swallowed by an American crocodile in the Everglades, and another lands in a Wyoming forest where a wolf is exposed to the pathogen. Primatologist Davis Okoye, a former Special Forces soldier and member of an anti-poaching unit, works at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. He is friends with a rare leucistic western lowland gorilla named George that he saved from poachers who murdered his mother and communicates with him via sign language. One of the canisters crash lands in George's habitat, and he is exposed to the pathogen. As George grows considerably larger and becomes more aggressive, Davis is contacted by genetic engineer Dr. Kate Caldwell, who explains that the pathogen was developed by Energene to rewrite genes on a massive scale. She had hoped to advance research on CRISPR as a potential cure for diseases, but discovered Energene's plans to use it as a biological weapon and was falsely incarcerated, during which her terminally ill brother died. George escapes from captivity and runs amok at the preserve. George calms down but is soon captured by a government team led by Agent Harvey Russell and put on a Boeing C-17 Globemaster III airplane. Meanwhile, Claire and her brother Brett oversee a mercenary team's attempt to capture the mutated wolf Ralph, which goes awry as the entire team is killed. Claire, resolving to capture Ralph and use George to cover up her plot, uses a massive transmitter atop the Willis Tower to lure the animals, engineered to respond aggressively to a certain radio frequency, to Chicago, unconcerned about the massive risk to civilian lives this poses. George reacts violently to the sound and crashes the plane, though Davis, Kate, and Russell parachute to safety. George survives the crash and joins Ralph as they make their way to Chicago, while Davis and Kate are aided by Russell in stealing a military helicopter in pursuit. They arrive to find George and Ralph tearing through the city as the military struggles to stop them. The crisis worsens when the mutated crocodile Lizzie joins the duo. Planning to steal an antidote to turn the animals back to normal, Davis and Kate infiltrate Energine's base of operations at the tower and take several vials of it, but are caught by the Widens as Claire reveals that the antidote only eliminates the animals as enhanced aggressiveness rather than reversing the other effects, and shoots Davis, but he survives. When George climbs to the top of the tower, Claire orders Davis to distract him while she attempts to escape with Kate at gunpoint. Kate slips a vial into Claire's handbag and pushes her toward George, who swallows her whole along with the vial, returning him to his former personality. Down below, Russell takes incriminating evidence from Brett, who is then crushed to death by falling debris. As the damaged tower topples, Davis and Kate survive by crash-landing a helicopter on the Federal Plaza. Davis stays to help George defeat the other animals, while Kate and Russell rush to prevent the military from deploying a GBU-43B Moabie against them. George then combats Ralph, whom Davis tricks into advancing towards Lizzie, who decapitates him using her jaws before chasing Davis, but George intervenes in time for him to incapacitate her using grenades, only to be undeterred. Continuing to struggle against Lizzie, Davis is nearly killed before George pierces her through the eye with a rebar that nearly impaled him, killing Lizzie. With the threat neutralized, the airstrike is aborted as Davis is joined by his allies to help rescue misplaced civilians. Cast: human. Dwayne Johnson as Davis Okoye, a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, as well as primatologist and head of an anti-poaching unit. Naomie Harris as Catherine Kate Caldwell, a disgraced genetic engineer who teams up with Okoye. Malin Åkerman as Claire Wyden, the CEO of Energine, the company responsible for the pathogen that caused George, Lizzie, and Ralph's mutations. Jeffrey Dean Morgan as Harvey Russell, a government agent who works for the other government agency. Jake Lacy as Brett Wyden, Claire's dim-witted brother. Joe Manganiello as Burke, the leader of a private military group. Marley Shelton as Carrie Atkins, a scientist and astronaut. P.J. Byrne as Nelson, a scientist and friend of Okoye. Demetrius Gross as Colonel Blake. Jack Quaid as Connor. Brienne Hill as Amy. Matt Gerald as Zamet. Will Yun Lee as Agent Park. Urijah Faber as Garrick. Gorillas. Jason Lyles as the motion capture performance for George, a leucistic western lowland gorilla, comparable to Snowflake, raised and trained by Okoye. George is highly intelligent, understanding sign language with which he communicates with Okoye. He also has a sense of humor, often joking with Davis. George becomes one of the animals affected by Energine's pathogen that increases their sizes and turns and mutates them into giant rampaging monsters. Sky Notary and Willow Notary as the motion capture of a pair of female gorillas called Femi and Inu, who also live in George's habitat. Vincent Roxburgh as the motion capture of Pavo, a young male gorilla who lives in George's habitat, uncredited. Production, development. Warner Brothers acquired the film adaptation rights to the 1986 arcade game Rampage in 2009 as part of their acquisition of Midway Games for $33 million. The project was announced in November 2011, with John Rickard set as a producer. Rickard said that he decided to work on the movie by searching the list of titles to which Warner held the adapting rights, and upon finding Rampage, remembering playing the arcade game. In June 2015, Dwayne Johnson was set to star, re-teaming with New Line and producer Beau Flynn, while the studio was looking for a director to start production in mid-2016. Johnson mentioned that he loved the game as a child, playing the arcade game in a pool hall and later owning it on the Nintendo Entertainment System. During the search for a script, writers offered many takes, including a faithful one to the game where the monsters were mutated humans, before the producers settled on the one by Ryan Engle, who aimed to make a love letter to the monster movies I grew up watching, such as Jaws and Jurassic Park, while making it clear that the animals were not the heroes. After Dwayne Johnson was cast in July, Brad Peyton went to direct and produce. Between January and July 2017, the rest of the supporting cast was assembled. Rampage marked the final released Warner Bros. Film to be financed by Access Entertainment, Rat Pack Dune Entertainment, as the studio had ended their partnership with the company due to sexual harassment allegations against Rat Pack Dune owner Brett Ratner, which resulted in the company going uncredited. The company subsequently dissolved later that year. Filming. Principal photography on the film began on April 17, 2017, in Chicago, Illinois. The film also was shot in Atlanta, Georgia. Easter eggs to the original game were featured, as Energine's offices have a Rampage arcade machine, George eats a person who he pulls out of a building he punched, and Claire is devoured while wearing a red dress, just as the woman featured in the arcade's opening screen. Visual effects. The visual effects were primarily provided by Weta Digital. Effects supervisor Eric Winquist and a small crew traveled to Chicago to create a model of the Chicago Loop that would be destroyed in the climactic battle, learning the building materials and architecture styles. Up to 15,000 photographs were taken with 3D scanners, while motion cameras covered downtown Chicago. As reference for the building destruction, the artists studied both the World Trade Center collapse from 2001 and implosions of buildings affected by the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake in Weta's hometown of Wellington. One of the more challenging aspects for Weta was figuring out how the weight and mass of the monsters would affect the city environment and destruction. Given Weta had plenty of experience creating animated apes in King Kong and Rise of the Planet of the Apes and its sequels Dawn and War, it helped the studio create George in a much shorter time than it may have 10 years ago, according to Winquist. Motion capture coach Terry Notary even took a break from Avengers Infinity War, which was also filmed in Atlanta, to help Jason Liles in his performance as George. On the other hand, the lack of motion capture for Ralph and Lizzie let the animators go loose with how these monsters were portrayed, such as a wolf that has porcupine spines and wings. Other VFX companies like Hydraulic Scanline VFX and UPP contributed to the film. Music, main article, Rampage soundtrack. The music was composed by Andrew Lockington. The film marked Lockington's fourth collaboration with director Brad Peyton. An exclusive track was also released by Kid Cudi titled The Rage, which plays in the film's end credits. The soundtrack was released digitally on April 13, 2018 by Water Tower Music. Marketing. As part of the promotion, 3 new games were made available. One is a browser game called Rampage City Smash. Another, an arcade beat-em-up playing more as a redemption game, was made available at Dave & Buster's, and a free VR game called Project Rampage VR. Release. Theatrical. Rampage was released on April 13, 2018 by Warner Bros. Pictures, after initially being set for release a week later, on April 20th. The release date was moved up after Avengers Infinity War had also shifted its release up by a week to April 27th so as to provide Rampage with a 2-week cushion. The film was coincidentally released 3 weeks after Pacific Rim Uprising, another American kaiju film. Home media. Rampage was released on digital HD on June 26, 2018, and on 4K UHD, Blu-ray 3D, Blu-ray, and DVD on July 17, 2018. To date, Rampage has sold $28.7 million worth of DVDs and Blu-rays in North America. Reception. Box office. Rampage grossed $101 million in the United States and Canada, and $327 million in other territories, for a worldwide total of $428 million, against a production budget of $120 million, plus another $140 million for the marketing budget. Deadline Hollywood reported that the film was likely to break even 2 years after its release after accounting for all revenue streams. In the United States and Canada, Rampage was released alongside the openings of Truth or Dare and Saget Stubby, An American Hero, as well as the wide expansion of Isle of Dogs, and was projected to gross $35 to $40 million from 3,950 theaters in its opening weekend. The film made $11.5 million on its first day, including $2.4 million from Thursday night previews, $13.9 million on Saturday, and a total of $35.7 million over the weekend, finishing first at the box office. Like many films starring Johnson, the audience demographics were diverse, with 43% being Caucasian, 21% Hispanic, 19% African American, and 14% Asian. The film dropped 41% in its second weekend to $21 million, finishing second behind A Quiet Place, which was in its third week. In its third weekend, the film fell 64% to $7.1 million, finishing fourth. It fell 35% in its fourth weekend, grossing $4.6 million and finishing fifth. In its fifth weekend, it fell just 27% and grossed $3.3 million and finished seventh. Critical response: on review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 51% based on 283 reviews and an average rating of 5.310. The website's critical consensus reads, "Rampage isn't as fun as its source material, but the movie's sheer button-mashing abandon might satisfy audiences in the mood for a brainless blockbuster." T became the best-reviewed live-action video game film in the history of the site until the release of Pokémon Detective Pikachu the following year. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 45 out of 100, based on 46 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on an A+ to F scale, while PostTrack reported adult and children filmgoers gave it respective overall positive scores of 90% and 86%. Variety's Peter DeBrugge gave the film a moderately positive review, saying, "However derivative it may be, Rampage knows its audience, namely Transformers fans and kids born after 9/11, for whom elaborately orchestrated scenes of falling skyscrapers carry nary a whiff of real-world trauma. What director Peyton lacks in artistic vision, he compensates for in his ability to wrangle such a CG-intensive production." Brian Tallarico of RogerEbert.com gave the film 2.54 stars and wrote that when Johnson is doing that movie action star thing he does so well and giant animals are going enormous mano, there's undeniably goofy fun to be had. You just have to be patient during the downtime. The Mere Fantastici review gave the movie 7 tenths, claiming it's a stupid movie, but one that's good at what it's supposed to be, and honest about not being any more than that. Michael Phillips of the Chicago Tribune gave the film 1.5 out of 4 stars, reviewing, "Rampage is a drag. 3 times during the thing I wrote down the phrase 'no fun' with increasingly impatient underlines." In an article for The Hollywood Reporter, Nick Allen wrote about what he called the film's disastrous tone, saying that, despite the Rampage arcade cabinets being constantly visible in its villain's headquarters, director Brad Peyton's live-action adaptation comes off as too emotionally glib and mean-spirited, even for a mega-budget B-movie. Empire described it as quintessential Johnson project. "It sounds like a dreadful basis for a movie, and it sort of is, but it's also sort of a lot of fun." Empire notes that the film is not as tongue-in-cheek as viewers might expect, concluding that Rampage is big dumb fun, but not as big dumb and fun as it could have been. Accolade: Rampage was nominated for 3 Teen Choice Awards in the category Choice Sci-Fi Movie and for the acting performances of Dwayne Johnson, Choice Sci-Fi Movie Actor, and Naomie Harris, Choice Sci-Fi Movie Actress. Director Brad Peyton was asked if the rat in the beginning of the film was based on Larry from the Atari Lynx port of the original game. Peyton responded, "We didn't name him Larry, but I'm going to use that. If there is a sequel, I'm going to make the rat's name Larry." The film was also speculated to be a prequel to the Walking Dead television series because of the similarities between Negan and Harvey Russell, both of whom are played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Lawsuit allegation. In late March 2018, German director Uwe Boll, famous for his movie adaptations of video games, threatened to file a lawsuit against Warner Bros. If the studio did not change the film's title. Boll, who produced and directed an unrelated Rampage film trilogy about a spree-killing revolutionary who shares Boll's political views, claimed that the Warner Bros. Film would shrink his brand and revenues he could use for future installments of his Rampage films. He also went on to say that the Warner Bros. Film confuses the audience and is one of those typical feel-good popcorn movies. Potential sequel. In July 2017, Dwayne Johnson discussed the potential for a sequel and offered an appearance role to Mike Mattai. By April 2018, director Brad Peyton stated that he was open to returning as director for a potential sequel, while confirming that a concept for the project's story is mapped out. Johnson referred to his repeated works with Peyton as his director, stating that he enjoys working with the filmmaker from a creative standpoint and looks forward to future collaborations. In December 2021, Hiram Garcia confirmed that Warner Bros. Pictures wants a sequel, while Seven Bucks Productions delayed development in favor of other projects. Review. I wonder how people know that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's monster thriller Rampage is actually based on a video game first released to arcades in 1986. I remember it well. As someone who spent a lot of time as a kid in that lively arcade culture, I was never the biggest fan of the Rampage video game. I can honestly say I like the movie adaptation even less. Johnson is a hard-working guy, as evident by his 15 feature films since 2013, mostly big-budget blockbusters, in addition to his ongoing HBO television series. Most of his movies are built around his infectious personality and charisma. Admittedly, I often find that to be enough for me to enjoy his movies to some degree. Despite all the charm Johnson musters, it still isn't enough to save Rampage from its plethora of problems. The setup goes like this. A mutated lab rat destroys a space station owned by Energene Corporation, sending debris crashing through Earth's atmosphere. Some of the wreckage is contaminated by a mysterious pathogen which causes mutations upon impact with the surface. By mutations, I mean a giant alligator in Florida, one mean flying wolf in Wyoming, and a gentle albino gorilla in San Diego. The gorilla's name is George, and he resides in a wildlife sanctuary after being saved from poachers by his beefy primatologist buddy Davis Okoye Johnson. As with the other mutations, George begins to grow at an alarming rate and quickly becomes more aggressive. Okoye is contacted by an ex-Energene geneticist, Naomie Harris, in a thankless role, who reveals the nefarious plans of the company's diabolical CEO and on-the-nose Malin Åkerman. You guessed it, the pathogen will be sold as a biological weapon to the highest bidders. The tonal gymnastics kicks up a notch when Davis tries to stop a now free-roaming George, tries to stop the monster-sized wolf and gator, and tries to stop an evil corporate head. That's a lot of stopping to do, even for The Rock. During this chunk of the movie, things constantly bounce around between playful and ultra-serious. Jeffrey Dean Morgan shows up in full-blown Negan mode, see The Walking Dead, as a secret government agent who's not buying into Davis's story. Morgan is obviously having fun, and his character adds some much-needed levity. Rampage sports some nice special effects, but there isn't much past that. As much as I tried to connect, the film was too much of a slog. Aside from Morgan, most of the humor falls flat. A reoccurring lazy and unfunny gag between Davis and George must have been ripped from Every Which Way But Loose. It was funnier in the Clint Eastwood picture. Even worse, the characters are uninteresting, and there is no suspense whatsoever. Plot: primatologist Davis Okoye Johnson, a man who keeps people at a distance, shares an unshakable bond with George, the extraordinarily intelligent silverback gorilla who has been in his care since birth. But a rogue genetic experiment gone awry mutates this gentle ape into a raging creature of enormous size. To make matters worse, it's soon discovered there are other similarly altered animals. As these newly created alpha predators tear across North America, destroying everything in their path, Okoye teams with a discredited genetic engineer to secure an antidote, fighting his way through an ever-changing battlefield, not only to halt a global catastrophe, but to save the fearsome creature that was once his friend. Review. Isn't it amazing the shite we pay money to watch in theaters these days? I knew going in that Rampage would be big dumb fun, and that it was, but for some reason I was expecting to enjoy it more than I did. I wasn't anticipating anything special by any means, but even if it's a silly monster flick, I still want the script to be less cringeworthy. The Rock himself says it best in this very movie when he says, "Well, this sucks," which summed it up perfectly. Performance-wise, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is pretty much the same as he is in every other movie, and does his usual shtick of making wisecracks about how big his muscles are and so on, but he has real screen presence, and his sheer star power makes any movie of his tolerable. I respect the hell out of him for how hard he works, but I only really like a handful of his movies, and I wish they would live up to his marketing/hype machine. I suppose I'm not really the target audience, and this is aimed at a younger crowd, and admittedly the people I watched it with seemed to enjoy it and even clapped at the end, for some reason. Rampage does exactly what you'd expect, and the highlight was Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who is as cool as always, and he wasn't the Negan-style character we'd thought he would be. I really liked what they did with him, which gave some nice surprises to the story. It was great to see Joe Manganiello and Matt Gerald playing a pair of military badasses, even if they didn't exactly have huge roles. The visual effects were also very impressive, with the creatures looking well rendered, and there's plenty of destruction in Chicago for the finale. It seemed like an odd movie to have 9/11-style references in, though, and you'll know the scene I'm talking about when you see it. I thought Malin Åkerman and Jake Lacy were very cartoonish villains, and Lacy was especially terrible, but the scene involving George and Åkerman was the absolute highlight of the movie. There are some impressive set pieces, and I thought the plane crash sequence was one of the most exciting scenes. Keep your eyes open for the Rampage arcade machine in the background during a few scenes, which was a nice nod. I used to have the original game on my Commodore 64, that's how old I am, and the movie had a few familiar references which fans will surely enjoy. It's difficult to review a movie like this. I mean, we're not going in expecting philosophical musings on the human condition. It's about monsters fighting and destroying buildings, and for that reason alone, Rampage succeeds. Overall, Rampage wasn't quite as much fun as I'd hoped and was mostly let down by a dire script, but The Rock's charisma and impressive action set pieces will bring in audiences. Here's a film to remind you that while most guys of 45 have paunch bulges on their tummy that balloon outwards as they bend forward, Dwayne Johnson gets 2 or 3 on the back of his big shaven head when he looks up. The nape of the Man Mountain's neck ripples with mini spare tires, and he's doing a lot of gym-built rubbernecking at the ginormous creatures crashing around overhead in this enjoyably preposterous summer actioner, based on the 80s video game of the same name. It's directed by Brad Peyton, who was also in charge of San Andreas, Dwayne's last movie featuring a lot of helicopters. Soon George is growing out of control, and so are a few other animals, including a wolf and something that looks like a crocodile crossed with a warthog. The only person who can talk to George, and maybe even get his assistance in tackling the whole big animal chaos issue, is Davis. In the traditional creature feature manner, he gets assistance from a bona fide scientist who was once employed by the same creepy corporation running the experiments until she realized how irresponsible they were. This is Dr. Kate Caldwell, played by Naomie Harris. The pair of them are also given grudging help from a government agent named Russell, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, a good old Texan boy who is permitted a pearl-handled revolver in an open-carry holster attached to his belt. When science shits the bed, says Russell brusquely, I'm the guy they call to change the sheets. Charming. As for the evil corporation, this appears to be run by just 2 people, who may be married or may be creepy squabbling siblings, played by Malin Åkerman and Jake Lacy, although they could as well be played by Amy Poehler and Will Arnett, recreating their performances from Blades of Glory. It is entertainingly over the top, although perhaps the CGI work isn't quite out of the top drawer. Maybe if quite so much of the budget hadn't been splurged on that rats in space scene at the beginning, the crashing helicopter work could have been fine-tuned. As for Rampage 2, surely one of the army of screenwriters is going to wonder out loud what would happen if Dwayne Johnson himself accidentally inhaled the supersized drug. Based on a popular arcade game from the 80s, Rampage is about 3 giant creatures wreaking havoc on human cities. Davis, Dwayne Johnson, is a primatologist and handler of one of the creatures, George the gorilla. While the creatures destroy everything in their path, Davis teams up with Dr. Chadwell, Naomie Harris, and Agent Russell, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, to stop them. Review. Rampage, as the name would suggest, is a movie about giant creatures tearing up the civilized world. As you'd expect from this genre, faithful, there's an abundance of loud and gory violence as a giant albino gorilla, a Godzilla-like crocodile, and a mammoth wolf run rampant in the human world. Their only foil is a Hulk-sized Dwayne Johnson playing a hybrid of characters he's played before in movies like Journey to the Mysterious Island, San Andreas, Jumanji, and Welcome to the Jungle / The Rundown. Like most creature features, Rampage is a film with a simple premise. The giant mutated creatures will break and smash everything in sight while the muscular hero and his band of eclectic individuals will try to save the day. The original Smash 'em Up game was about breaking and climbing buildings. The movie scales up those seemingly simple actions with a sci-fi upgrade. Here, a science experiment on advanced genetics being conducted aboard a space station goes horribly wrong, in a Ridley Scott's Alien sort of way. The mutagen crash lands on Earth, and it turns an average wolf, crocodile, and an exotic-looking gorilla into giant, scary monsters. The company behind the experiments is headed by the greedy sister-brother duo Claire, Malin Åkerman, and Brett Wyden, Jake Lacy, who only care about making profits from the biological Armageddon at hand. In the ensuing mayhem of the creatures running around Chicago, the U.S. Army joins Davis and his friends to both record and stop the doom. The action in Rampage has been captured to great effect. The sights of blowing up cars and breaking skyscrapers doesn't look dizzying as it did in films like The Avengers or Man of Steel. While this is no superhero film, the crash and burn action sequences certainly give the effect of one. Dwayne Johnson squares off against these monsters like he's a superhero. Thankfully, there are no OTT sequences featuring him killing the creatures. But his on-screen charisma is big enough to keep you hooked onto the film. The biggest flaw of Rampage, though, is its predictability. Every set piece in this movie has been done to death in movies like King Kong, Godzilla, and Johnson's own San Andreas. Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the cowboy super agent, though, is a big put-off. Same goes for Naomie Harris, who plays the clever scientist like a damsel in distress. Despite the pastiche form, director Brad Peyton still manages to make this mindless action fiesta a fun ride. His film isn't the smartest movie ever made, but it does serve up some cool fanboys moments. The camaraderie between the gorilla and Dwayne Johnson is cool, brings in an element of humor to this otherwise generic end-of-the-world movie. Memories of the arcade game haven't really faded away from my own memory as I was setting foot into Rampage. No matter how low I can set my expectations for whatever sort of movie that I know he's starring in, I have to admit that I always admired how Dwayne Johnson is always ready to show that he's having so much fun no matter what movie he's taking part of. Now that he's reuniting with the director of San Andreas for a movie based on an arcade game, I think it's easy to say expectations would be set. Rampage is a dumb movie, but its own sense of self-awareness makes it far more enjoyable as a film you can turn your brain off to, with the added charisma of The Rock in order to keep oneself from being bored. Although I suppose that given the sort of movie that Rampage was made to be, you can already say that is a good thing. Rampage Flying Wolf, one must only set their expectations appropriately when they know that this film is based on a Midway arcade game of the same name, where you take control of mutated creatures that were formerly human in order to battle against military forces while destroying the city as you keep going. So how exactly can a story be made from this concept to be made into a film? For starters, you have Dwayne Johnson as a primatologist who is looking after George, known for being the gorilla avatar from the games. After the mild-mannered George becomes exposed to radiation from a genetic experiment having gone terribly wrong, a burst of rage turns what once was a calm yet intelligent ape into a raging monster, not without the company of a mutated alligator and wolf. So that there would be as close as we can actually get to being anything like the actual game, but I'm not so sure how exactly a story can be made from an arcade game that was based on how much you caused havoc by destroying the city of Chicago. Rampage seems gleefully aware of this, and that's only a part of what makes the ride as entertaining as it is. It seems to be aware of what it is that limits itself from being anything more than mindless fun, and somehow makes the very most of that by at least giving its leads enough room to share their own charisma for as much as they can play caricatures. When the destruction is already bound to take place, it's never boring. You have great visual effects, and Dwayne Johnson having as much fun as he possibly can within the role of a primatologist. It certainly wasn't at all what I would have expected on behalf of director Brad Peyton. After having directed the Roland Emmerich clone San Andreas, but at least he found the perfect source material in order to embrace the cheesiness of what he is writing by placing it within the perfect environment. What I'm left to ask about, though, is, why would this be the exact route to go forward with if we are making a movie based on Rampage? As much as it never takes itself so seriously to the point that it can become rather entertaining, you can't help but feel that it also happens to be faithless to its source material, which shouldn't be the basis for which one judges the quality of an adaptation, but considering the game was about humans that turned into monsters, why go away from that? It isn't the same Rampage that people would have remembered this way. It's just a movie about a primatologist trying to stop an out-of-control gorilla from causing more destruction to the city, which was the very foundation upon which the game was based on. It never exactly helped that with everything about George that had properly been established, Lizzie and Ralph only seemed to just pop up for the film's climax, with not much shared time together. You can't walk into Rampage expecting anything more than dumb. The villain's motivations, as played by a rather flat Malin Åkerman, are unbelievably convoluted, almost akin to last year's The Mummy, but it's hard not to find at least some entertainment from a film that seems so willing to embrace that about itself. At the very least, you get to see how Dwayne Johnson became a primatologist, especially when the casting sounds so awkward on the outside, but it's hard not to enjoy the fact he's so clearly having fun with what he has to work with. In its best moments, you have something that's so entertaining, but in its worst moments, you're either cringing or just outright questioning the very foundations upon which the film was made. This may very well be one of the best films to have been made based on a video game, but whether or not that is an endorsement is completely up to you. Rampage, the latest opus of urban destruction from director Brad Peyton, San Andreas, and megastar Dwayne Johnson, may legitimately be the stupidest movie I've ever seen. And I watched Air Bud last weekend for some reason. It's also 100% the movie it looks like, with zero deviation. That's not to say it's without a certain level of fun, thanks almost entirely to The Rock, who does what The Rock does best. Only this time there are giant monsters too. It's somehow completely bonkers and totally forgettable in the same moment. When Johnson charms and cracks wise and basically plays his smart aleck self, which is graciously most of the movie, and Rampage offers a lunk-headed wild ride. The frontman of the whole shebang knows precisely what movie he's in, as does Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who slimes and smarmy grins his way through the film as a shady government agent who likes to play cowboy. He seriously has a pearl-handled pistol he carries strapped to the front of his pants and that he regularly strokes. When Rampage lets loose with the mayhem, things move at a nice clip. It's easy to gloss over the idiotic bits, and it's possible to bask in the absurd audacity of it all. But for a movie based on a plotless 1980s arcade game, it has an insanely convoluted plot that bogs the entire thing down. Its key mistake is slowing down so the audience has time to recognize how idiotic it truly is. The game is simple. A mutant ape, mutant wolf, and Godzilla-ish lizard eat Chicago. In the game, there are also people who turned into these creatures, a fact glossed over on screen. In order to get to this point in the movie, the four credited screenwriters cook up a cockamamie narrative that involves illegal biological weapons, a barely mentioned backstory about banned genetic engineering tech, a thread about mercenaries that goes nowhere, industrial espionage, a momentary anti-poaching screed, and a whole lot of other nonsense. You can forgive the ridiculous nature of the story and the ludicrous setup. After all, this movie is about monsters destroying a major metropolitan city. Thought obvious 9/11 callbacks are in poor taste. But when this absurdity drags the pace and tempo to a dead stop, which happens multiple times throughout, Rampage just tanks. There's simply nothing else to prop it up. Dwayne Johnson plays Davis Okoye, a primatologist who rescued an albino ape named George from poachers and raised him. They're buddies who do things like prank the new interns at the animal sanctuary where they work. I'm not kidding. Davis is also an ex-military special forces badass. Then there are the Widens, Malin Åkerman and Jake Lacy, a brother-sister duo of cartoonish industrialists who fund off-the-books experiments in space, which of course come crashing down to Earth and kickstart everything. We also have Dr. Kate Caldwell, a tragically squandered Naomie Harris, a now disgraced geneticist with her own links to both these experiments and the Widens. And it goes on and on and on. Where Rampage completely shits the bed is when the script derails all the forward momentum with a 5-minute scene where people stand around in a lab and say science words in an attempt to sound smart. Also, at one point, Dr. Caldwell uses Wikipedia to prove her point, like a real scientist. Or when the villains stand around in a boardroom and recount in depth their villainous plan to each other. It's not quite, "Hey, brother, we have been conducting illegal genetic experiments in space, and we could go to jail," but it's not much better. Rampage is only 107 minutes long, but there's so much superfluous filler that you could hack 25 minutes off the runtime and vastly improve the movie. For a movie that wastes so much time, there's nothing going on. Everything gets the most slapdash, convenient explanation. Oh, the wolf is named Ralph because weirdos on the internet. The monsters need to be in Chicago. Of course, the bad guys have a thing that calls them directly to Chicago. Lazy seems mean. But it's not even that these pieces are unnecessary or dumb, though they are. The villain's plan is truly, truly moronic. It's that they damage the one thing the movie has going for it: fast-paced, spectacle-level action. The action is at least passable. Peyton and cinematographer Jaron Pressant, who worked in the camera department on San Andreas, are most comfortable when raising cityscapes. Again, the 9/11 parallels are, in this situation, not great, and as egregious as anything Zack Snyder did in Man of Steel, though with even less purpose. They have a firm grasp on the geography of building collapses. They're less sure-footed, however, when it comes to action choreography involving giant CGI monsters. The staging isn't always on point, and like so many movies of this ilk, the relative size of the creatures often doesn't match. From scene to scene, even shot to shot, consistency proves an issue. For instance, in one scene, Lizzie, the mutant alligator, dwarfs George, only for them to be roughly the same size a few cuts later. It's really The Rock that carries everything worthwhile about Rampage. Without his charisma and winking charm in every scene, it would be an utter disaster. And not the intended kind of disaster. The script hits hard the relationship between Davis and George, with little success. It's fine and does what it needs to, but there's never much emotional investment, and that's the only place the film could cram any in. But for his part, Johnson shoulders through. He can shrug, say things like, "Of course the wolf flies," and it slides. While every other character basically serves to deliver exposition, he just teams up with a great ape, Friends, to fight a giant lizard and a spine-covered wolf. If someone has to, I guess I'm glad it's him. The new movie Rampage can be categorized in a lot of ways. The latest attempt to convert a popular and long-running video game into a film. The latest vehicle for Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, further evidence of summer movie creep, in which big-budget blockbusters are released further and further outside the summer months until the entire calendar year is filled up with junk like Rampage. I would call it what I recently referred to as a time capsule movie for all the ways in which it represents the worst of what Hollywood is currently capable, but that suggests I will remember Rampage by the time I finish writing this review. That's unfucking likely. Dwayne Johnson plays Davis Okoye, former Special Forces and anti-poaching soldier turned primatologist whose best friend is an albino gorilla named George, played by a shit ton of pixels and the motion capture performance of Jason Liles. One day, a canister of a militarized pathogen created by Energene as part of their CRISPR research lands in the wildlife preserve and explodes in George's face. The gorilla immediately begins to mutate, becoming enormous and aggressive and attracting the attention of Dr. Kate Caldwell, Naomie Harris, a former Energene scientist who developed the pathogen as part of her CRISPR research, and Agent Harvey Russell, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, a government agent working for an unspecified shadow organization. George breaks out of his enclosure and begins heading for Chicago, where Energene CEO Claire Wyden, Malin Åkerman, and her brother Brett, Jake Lacy, have called him by putting out a signal using modified bat sonar as part of their CRISPR research. Claire Wyden and her brother Brett want to use the mutated George, as well as an enormous mutated wolf, which internet weirdos are calling Ralph, as part of their CRISPR research to create various mutated species and strains of DNA that can be weaponized for military applications. It's up to Davis Okoye, Dr. Kate Caldwell, and Special Agent Harvey Russell to to track George all the way to Chicago to try to find the antidote that will cure him somewhere in the Energenie facilities, as well as protect the city from the impending attack by George, Ralph, and a mutated alligator that is also heading to Chicago underwater, but is mostly kept a secret for the majority of the movie's running time. If you read my reviews very often, you might already know that I don't spend a lot of time recapping a movie's plot. This is because A, I don't want to give away any more than I need to, and B, the plot is almost always the least interesting aspect of a movie for me to discuss. You might also notice that I just spent a great deal of time explaining the plot of Rampage in pretty specific detail. This is because typing out the film's plot is practically akin to reviewing it, as just reading the summary should be more than enough evidence of just how fucking stupid this movie is. Energene. CRISPR. Yes, CRISPR is a thing. It's just not a thing that should be talked about so much in a movie about monsters attacking Chicago. Davis Okoye. Energene. What's so goddamn galling about the movie's screenplay is that it's credited to no fewer than 4 writers, which means it probably passed through the hands of at least 20 different screenwriters during its development. This is the best they could come up with. Everyone is let down and done dirty by Rampage. Dwayne Johnson is fine, I guess, but saddled with a role that exposes him for having one trick and a willingness to appear in big, noisy shit so long as he gets a cool name and a leather jacket. The fact that his character has to have multiple backstories and occupations, special forces and anti-poacher and guerrilla expert, is proof of just how hacky this screenplay is. Every single other person in the film comes off terribly. Naomie Harris is a great Oscar-nominated actress who is insanely charming as Moneypenny and a badass in 28 Days Later and Miami Vice, but here has to keep saying the word Energene with a straight face. The thought of her reading this dialogue and knowing she was going to have to try to sell while cameras were rolling was making me sad every minute she was on screen. Jeffrey Dean Morgan, once a promising leading man in The Losers, goes full Negan here. All bullshit southern drawl and hammy overacting, and a stupid cowboy gun tucked into his pants so he can be cooler than the average special agent. Malin Åkerman and Jake Lacy are the bad hair twins and have the worst scenes in the movie. Joe Manganiello shows up and shouldn't. The movie opens with Marley Shelton playing a part she's both too famous and too talented to play, but Hollywood has done her dirty. Fuck, everything in this movie depressed me. Rampage was probably doomed from the start when its endless series of screenwriters and rewrites decided that it should be the story of The Rock and his gorilla friend. Turning it into a star vehicle with a lovable CG animal that can be merchandised hobbles the story, requiring the whole thing to be reverse engineered to make that work. Corporate conspiracies and lady scientists and government agencies have to be added so that the pieces fit, which is to say that the pieces don't fit and the movie is barely functional. There is an obvious way to adapt Rampage for a movie. Use the 70s disaster movie model, only the disaster is the arrival of 3 giant monsters. Somehow, Independence Day knew enough to use this template back in 1996, but the current model depends too greatly on a single marketable face to sell a movie. Even San Andreas pulled this shit, and that's literally a disaster movie. There's no trust in the potential of a slightly less famous ensemble of actors to carry a movie that ought to really be sold on giant monsters attacking a city. But even that would require that director Brad Peyton show any interest in staging moments, visual and story beats that stand out, and provide enough of a clothesline upon which to hang the rest of the less interesting expository details or underdeveloped characters. We remember the atomic kiss from Godzilla or the White House blowing up in Independence Day because they are moments. Rampage doesn't have a single moment I can recall, and I saw the thing less than 12 hours ago. 3/4 of the film are spent building up to the big destruction sequence, which means you really aren't getting what you paid for, giant monsters attacking, until the last act of the movie. When it does finally happen, there's almost no joy to be had because Peyton fails to present the images in a way that's at all interesting. Again, there are no moments. Chicago gets fucked up real good, so yay, I can see me die from here. It's all ugly visual noise, indecipherable gray rubble rendered on a computer, cut together with actors performing against obvious green screens, the lighting too bright and unnatural, the frame utterly flat. The truth of the movie is that it doesn't have to be giant monsters destroying the city at all. It could be anything. Robots, big alien worms, sentient gladware. It makes no fucking difference. This isn't a movie that has any affection or any wonder towards its monsters. They're in here because they're in the video game on which it's based. As someone who loves movie monsters of all sizes, the cynicism here is pretty disheartening. Surely I will be challenged and mocked for not turning off my brain and enjoying Rampage as a fun popcorn movie that delivers exactly what it's supposed to. I resent the implication that just because I love monster movies, I should be happy with Rampage because it has giant monsters. This is why I was attacked for disliking Jurassic World and Alien Covenant and The Mummy. As a monster kid, I'm supposed to just accept shit like this. I can't. I would first and foremost like Rampage because it's a good movie. Barring that, I could at least enjoy it if the monster stuff was fun. None of this is the case. Rampage is a big, expensive nothing. Rampage, the latest film from director Brad Peyton, San Andreas, is an exhilarating action-adventure movie that includes over-the-top creature designs that will still appeal to the masses while also finding enjoyment from fans of the horror genre. The film stars everyone's favorite Dwayne Johnson, a.k.a. The Rock, as well as Naomie Harris, Moonlight, Malin Åkerman, Final Girls, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, The Walking Dead, Jake Lacy, Miss Sloane, and Joe Manganiello, Magic Mike XL. The film centers around primatologist Davis Okoye, Dwayne Johnson, and his friendship with George, an albino gorilla that he has cared for since rescuing him from poachers as a child. Meanwhile, we learn that in space, a genetic company has been testing out a new experiment titled Rampage as a way to weaponize animals for combat. However, the experiment takes a harsh left turn, resulting in the formula escaping and crashing towards Earth, transforming George and two other ferocious animals into raging killing machine monsters. It's up to Okoye and his team to retrieve the antidote, not only to save George, but to stop a catastrophe from spreading across the world. Let me start off by saying that after seeing Rampage, I can say with 100% certainty that I will watch any movie that stars Dwayne Johnson. I don't care how ridiculous the premise is, Johnson delivers every single time and remains one of the most likable and enjoyable actors of the current times. Going into this film, I had very little expectations, mostly because it was based off a video game where monstrous creatures, such as George the gorilla, smashed buildings. I wasn't really sure how this was going to translate properly onto the big screen, but honestly, I wasn't disappointed at all. Having never played the game, I can't compare the enjoyment of the video game experience as it pertains to the film, but nevertheless, I walked away with a giant grin on my face and a happiness towards big-budget monster movies. What really blew me away with Rampage was how violent the film actually is. For a PG-13 rating, I was insanely impressed with the amount of bloodshed they were able to get away with. Also, without spoiling anything, there is a death scene that I was shocked to see occur, considering how high-profile one of the actors were. I love when films are willing to take a risk in killing off a big name early on. It's something that most big-budget movies aren't willing to do. For those of you wondering if there was enough horror elements in the film to satiate your cravings, I'm here to tell you, yes, there are. Though maybe not in the most traditional sense, depending on what you consider horror, the film packs some heavy punches in not only the monster creations, but also in violence and jump scares. The movie also presents us with a slew of acting talent that make the film even more enjoyable. We've already discussed briefly how incredible Johnson is, but it's important to also point out the strong female presence that this movie has. Not only do we have a troubled yet kick-ass scientist, Dr. Kate Caldwell, Naomie Harris, who becomes Okoye's right-hand person, but our main villain is played by Malin Åkerman. So often, the villain role is played by a male actor that it becomes a tad bit repetitive, so it was definitely refreshing to see a strong female character in that role. With all that said, I would have liked to have seen more screen time for these characters, and hopefully in future films, more strong female-based characters will reign supreme. Overall, as I'm sure you can tell, I absolutely loved Rampage. I loved the extreme antics of the monsters, I loved the silly premise of a weaponized experiment on animals gone wrong, and I love all the actors that were involved. Even though I'm a huge fan of practical effects, I was willing to put that aside in order to take in all the glorious CGI of the creature effects. I fully believe that sometimes we all just need an entertaining movie to take our minds off the horrors of day-to-day life, and Rampage was that movie for me. It may not be the best movie of the year, but you'll be hard-pressed to not have a hell of a good time watching it. Rampage is now out in theaters across the U.S. from Warner Bros. Primatologist Davis Okoye Johnson, a man who keeps people at a distance, shares an unshakable bond with George, the extraordinarily intelligent silverback gorilla who has been in his care since birth. But a rogue genetic experiment gone awry mutates this gentle ape into a raging creature of enormous size. To make matters worse, it's soon discovered there are other similarly altered animals. As these newly created alpha predators tear across North America, destroying everything in their path, Okoye teams with a discredited genetic engineer to secure an antidote, fighting his way through an ever-changing battlefield, not only to halt a global catastrophe, but to save the fearsome creature that was once his friend. I discovered that Rampage was actually based on an arcade game a few days before watching the movie. When I saw what the game was about, I was 90% sure this was not going to be a groundbreaking story, and I wasn't wrong. A lot of exposition scenes bring down what was surprisingly being a touching narrative. Unfortunately, it's boring and uninventive until the last act. It follows everything you would expect from an action monster blockbuster. The protagonists survive ridiculously implausible falls or explosions, expecting the audience to turn off their brains in order to believe the unbelievable. Brad Peyton shows good camera handling and an excellent use of the visuals, which definitely improve the monsters' fights. I mean, the action is amazing as expected, but that means nothing to me if there's no substance or real stakes to back them up. He ruins the tone with several silly tries at a Marvel move, jokes at the end of a serious moment, but they all fall flat. Also, the end ending is as annoying as it is frustrating. However, my main issue with the movie, and the thing that completely took me off of it, is the villains. The main characters are well developed, even if solely through exposition, but the villains are horrible. Really, really awful. And if that wasn't enough, Jake Lacy and Malin Åkerman's performances are able to turn an absurd script into something even worse. Their displays are extremely over the top and incredibly irritating, just as the characters they portray. Nevertheless, Rampage has a few points in its favor, even if it's still not a good film. With the exception of the actors mentioned in the above paragraph, the casting is pretty great. Dwayne Johnson proves that he is a multi-layered actor and that there is no one better to lead an action blockbuster than him. He didn't turn out to a typecast actor like I thought he would, and for that I have to congratulate him. Naomie Harris is great, as well as Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who lends his instant coolness to every single scene. Sadly, I think he is going in the way I thought The Rock would go. He basically plays a different version of Negan. It's not like I don't enjoy it. I mean, it's Jeffrey Dean Morgan, damn it. I just hope that he doesn't settle down and accept every single typecasting from now on. The visuals are exceptional. They truly are. The monsters are beautiful to look at, and their fights are jaw-dropping. The problem is that the audience only receives that massive destruction in the last 20-25 minutes. The CGI is remarkable throughout the entire runtime. The monsters are amazingly well blended into the environment. However, when Dwayne Johnson joins them, it either looks like a video game or the green screen is extremely noticeable, and don't ask me when, just watch the last trailer. Which brings me back around to talking about Rampage, the latest iteration endeavor of a film based on a video game. Like many, I do remember playing the original arcade game of Rampage and found it amusing, letting the classic button-mashing experience of destroying buildings and the like via playable giant monsters. For its time, it was good as an arcade video game, alongside Mortal Kombat, Pac-Man, and Gauntlet Dark Legacy as some of my favorites. When I first heard that there was going to be a Rampage movie, I, like many out there, was extremely skeptical about it, especially filling out the length of a feature film. Of course, hearing that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson being attached to the project piqued my interest, especially since Johnson has grown in popularity in the last few years. I did see Rampage's 2 trailers, and they really did little to excite me. Of course, they showcased the film's mayhem and destruction in the spurt of the game, but it just seemed like a vague premise for a motion picture. Still, I'm hoping for a good giant monster movie of it, and decided to take my chance and see Rampage. What did I think of it? Well, to be honest, it wasn't good. Despite a giant monster romp premise and very recognizable cast, Rampage ends up being one of those bad, messy blockbusters, loud and noisy, with a shell of a story and flat characters. There's some fun to it, but the movie itself should have never been made. Rampage is directed by Peyton, whose previous directorial works includes films like Journey to the Mysterious Island, San Andreas, and Incarnate. True to the spurt of giant monster flicks of old and to the film's marketing campaign, Peyton's approach to Rampage is something of a kitschy and overall go big or go home type of bravado that permeates the entire feature from start to finish. What do I mean? Well, much like what the film has been promised, Peyton makes Rampage self-aware on how silly its premise is, never taking its central essence too seriously, and is more action-oriented/driven than being overly dramatic. Peyton also does a decent job in keeping up the film's pace, as the movie is only 1 hour then 47 minutes long, and makes everything build to a point where big, cheesy action sequences and set pieces are the primary focus. As to be expected, Peyton makes the 3 classic giant monsters from the original arcade game, the Gorilla George, the Wolf Ralph, and the Crocodile Lizzie, be the big centerpieces of the feature, showcasing their mutated size and strength as they wreak havoc and destroy everything in their path. As a whole, Peyton finds a classic rhythm in the tentpoles of similar films, i.e. monster horror, disaster features, and military action adventures, in making Rampage come to life on the big screen. In a nutshell, if you're looking for a big and dumb fun giant monster that has a good helping of destruction and rampage from enormous mutated creatures, then Rampage might be for you. Again, it's one of the movies that you'll either love it or hate instantly. However, those who weren't taken in by the film's marketing campaign will probably never ever see this movie. In the presentation department, Rampage looks and feels like a summer blockbuster endeavor, with a lot bing bang boom exploding at the camera through its physical and visual representation. The movie's cinematographer Jaron Persant does a good job in capturing some of the film's most dynamic, dramatic moments with various camera angles of big action scenes, most of which involving George, Ralph, and Lizzie rampaging through highlighted locations. Coinciding with that is the film's production design by Barry Chusid, who does a solid job in creating some of the film's more physical construct in set layouts and overall design. Perhaps the most crucial part of Rampage's technical team is the film's visual team, which brings to life the giant monster trio of George, Ralph, and Lizzie to life, finding each one designed hideous and/or monstrously from their original counterpart, i.e. a gorilla, a wolf, and a crocodile. They might not be the absolute jaw-dropping best visual designs out there, but since Rampage is main focused on them and their rampaging destruction, it's favorable endeavor that helps the film's positives. Lastly, the film's score, which was composed by Andrew Lockington, adds a very robust musical tempo to the movie, building upon some of the film's more quieter moments, but mostly playing up the tension scale for the movie's more action-packed scenes. All in all, while the film does lack in many areas, more on the below, Rampage's physical and visual aspects are pretty good. Not great or superb, but still good as an industry standard within the realm of Hollywood blockbusters. Unfortunately, despite the film's blockbuster aspect and true to its marketing campaign, Rampage is a far cry from being a high-valued entertainment piece feature film. As I said, there's fun parts to it, but the movie has too many numerous problems that drag the movie down. Much what's expected is that the film is riddled, almost screams, in B-rated giant monster cheese and, While it can be amusing within the movie's context of three animals mutating/growing into enormous monstrous beings that rampage across the country, the movie itself can't overcome its numerous shortcomings of completely dim-witted and hackneyed. It's easy to notice that right from the get-go that there's not much in-depth and subversive plot being created in Rampage's narrative, and while that may be by design, it's quite transparent and completely redundant. The film's script, which was penned by 4 writers, Ryan Engle, Carlton Cuse, Ryan J., Condal, and Adam Steichel, is incredibly flimsy to the point where the actual plot of the movie is generic and derivative that it lacks a cinematic quality, even for an action blockbuster. The film itself is literally filled with plot holes and other things aren't fully explained, which makes the film's main narrative thread a bit hard to swallow, especially if you don't answer what's going on. Image result for Rampage 2018 film Morgan Rampage movie review Dwayne Johnson finally gets a star to match his size, if not charisma, in the sometimes gloriously ludicrous Rampage, a movie based on a hit arcade game that was literally just larger-than-life monsters bashing buildings. If you're thinking, wow, that seems like a flimsy premise from which to adapt a feature film, you're not entirely wrong, directed by San Andreas. Helmer Bradton, this CGI blockbuster is often a defiantly stupid movie, most comfortable with what it's trying to accomplish when giant monsters are destroying half of downtown Chicago. Or leaping on moving helicopters, it's the narrative tissue in between that allows the movie magic. Then, however, when Johnson is doing that movie action star thing he does so well, and giant animals are going enormous, enormous mono, there's undeniably goofy fun to be had. You just have to be patient during the downtime. Rampage opens by establishing its ridiculous tone early. A scientist on a space station is struggling to save some genetically engineered samples from, well, a mutated super rat. The station is on fire and everyone else appears dead, but she's ordered to save the science. Yes, Rampage opens with a super space rat aboard, and on fire spaceship hurtling to Earth. It's certainly a tone setter. The samples plummet to Earth and land in 3 locations. One happens to hit ground in a San Diego wildlife sanctuary. Managed by Davis Okoye Johnson, Davis' favorite beast is a giant albino gorilla named George, and the clever animal happens upon one of the genetic samples. Before you know it, George is growing at a never-before-seen rate, accompanied by increased aggression and insatiable hunger. He kills a bear, escapes, and, well, lots of things go boom. That's why you come to a movie like Rampage, to see and hear things go boom. A critical caveat seems appropriate here. I dig giant monster movies. I still awe at the 1933 King Kong, a movie that I consider among the most important ever made. I even dug Peter Jackson's 25 remake, as well as recent iterations of The King of the Monsters, both in Gareth Edwards' 2014 American version Godzilla and Hideaki Anno, and Shinji Hage's 2016 Japanese version Shin Godzilla. There's something about the spectacle of movies like King Kong and Godzilla that's singularly cinematic. It's not something that other forms like theater, TV, or fiction can do in quite the same way. Add disappreciation for big creatures slamming into buildings, with my belief that Dwayne Johnson is one of the few current working actors we can legitimately call a movie star, and Rampage should be a slam dunk. I even played the arcade game, so why isn't it a slam dunk? Sure, there are times when Rampage gives viewers exactly what they were hoping for when they opened their wallets or whipped out their movie pass. No one can really accuse this movie of not delivering on what was in the trailers, although one could argue the whole movie is in those trailers. So why isn't it that King Kong meets The Rock? It could have been First, the film seriously muddles its vague attempts at emotional undercurrents. Davis mentions early on that he likes the company of animals more than people, but to say he has no actual character would be an understatement. George is actually more developed, and Naomie Harris, eventual sidekick Kate, has an emotional backstory that's designed to make her more accessible, but really just falls flat. A scene between the two, when they share their pasts, including when Davis found George and saved him from poachers, is embarrassingly mishandled, but nothing sins the film more than Jake, Lacy, and me. Arian's villains, the nefarious siblings who run the evil company doing evil science things and making evil big animals and more evil stuff, they sometimes sound like they were written as over-the-top caricatures. Lacy's Brett actually says there's a reason we were doing these experiments in space, but the characters' performances are so bland that the movie sags every time they show up. More fun are Joe Manganiello's Soldier of Fortune and Jeffrey Dean. Morgan's AUGA other government agency. Officer Morgan delivers every line with a cocked neck and southern side eye that hints he knows how goofy this whole thing truly is, or at least should be. Morgan's having fun for sure. And Johnson is charismatic, but Peyton too often struggles to convey that big monster movie sense of excitement cinematically. Even when Rampage gets to the fireworks, it feels like it's too often going through the motions. There are just enough big beats, a giant wolf leaping at a mid-air helicopter George using tanks like toys on Michigan Avenue, all the animals climbing that will always be known as, to me, Sears Tower, to keep fans engaged. But monster movies should do more than just keep you engaged. They should wow, they should fascinate. They should strike the imagination in such a way that they allow things like cheesy dialogue and thin characters to not only that point where you can consistently ignore the things it does wrong, and that can be deadly for a movie about animals. The size of apartment buildings, it's a tonal balance that Rampage only sometimes hits. Maybe they'll perfect it in time for Dig Dug. Other information about this film, based on the same mid-80s Bali Midway arcade game that unofficially inspired Disney's Wreck-It Ralph. Brad Peyton's Rampage doesn't seem to understand its own appeal, reuniting disaster-resistant star Dwayne Johnson with his San Andreas director. This brainless big-screen monster smash movie assumes that audiences want to see The Rock stop 3 enormous mutant creatures from destroying American metropolises, when in fact it's the gleeful prospect of witnessing just that kind of spectacular CG devastation that gave the game its name and presumably got the movie made. Flipping the script on decades of nuclear monster movies, the original Rampage invites you to play as one of the 3 havoc-wreaking monstrosities: a giant ape, a Godzilla-like lizard, or an overgrown werewolf. In the game, the goal is to reduce as many buildings to rubble as possible, whereas this impressive-looking but relatively less amusing big screen adaptation gets it backward, reverting to the shrill Save Our Cities panic that fueled such hokey 1950s classics as Them and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, arriving in theaters mere weeks after Tomb Raider and Ready Player One. Rampage is but the latest big studio attempt to make good on Hollywood's most exasperating genre. The video game-based VFX showcase granted Spielberg's Baffo. RPO was adapted from a pop adventure book about a virtual UAL gaming platform, which surely explains why it works. Better than duds like Doom and the collected works of UAL, although they all suffer from the same problem. Whereas interactivity can make video games addictive to play, it's no fun to watch over someone else's shoulder, and so far, not a single live-action movie has managed to recreate the immersive thrill of steering the action for yourself. As for Rampage, the movie feels like exactly what it is: a mega-budget studio tent-pole reverse-engineered from an 8-bit arcade classic by no fewer than 4 screenwriters designed to eat dollars in much the same way the original game gobble quarters watching it. You can imagine the creative team straining to adequately acknowledge the source material as digital meanies punch holes in skyscrapers, stomp military vehicles, and snatch helicopters out of the air, but they would have been better off starting from scratch, because this is no longer Rampage. If instead of getting to root for the monsters who started out as normal predators, weaponized by a malicious gene-mutating formula, were asked to identify with a Dwayne Johnson action hero, instead Johnson, who plays San Diego Wildlife Preserve primatologist Davis Okoye, is a hugely entertaining screen presence in his own right. But there's something off about casting a guy who looks like the poster boy for human growth hormone in a movie that bills itself as a cautionary tale about the dangers of biological manipulation. Davis can talk to animals and shares a special bond with George, an albino gorilla who's learned to sign. Somewhere along the line, Davis taught George a handful of crude gestures which feature prominently in his vocabulary, while still making him the most articulate character on screen. Instead of going the big meets bigger route, as touted by the movie's tagline, this would have been a fun project in which to cast a pint-sized powerhouse like Alicia Vander, rejected by audiences as Laura Croft, but that would have made for a very different movie for what it's worth. Johnson does get a word-worthy female cohort in the form of Naomie Harris, who plays Dr. Kate Caldwell, the charismatic scientist responsible for inventing the out-of-control genetic editing technology. After a series of lab rat experiments conducted aboard a space station go horribly awry, resulting in the entire facility self-destructing in the opening scene, samples of Caldwell's formula fall to Earth, infecting George, who swells to King Kong proportions, an alpha wolf somewhere in southern Wyoming, and a crocodile in Glades National Park. Davis is devastated to see his beloved primate go berserk. Once he realizes what he's dealing with, his job is to track down the antidote before the monsters destroy an entire city, borrowing a page from the Ghostbusters playbook. The Rampage script alternates between pie jokes and pseudo-vent scientific mumbo-jumbo. Much of the latter falls to a pair of ruthless profiteers played by Malin Åkerman and Jake. Lacy, the movie goes unusually far out of its way to justify its far-fetched conceit, while showing complete disregard for natural laws at every turn. Not that popcorn audiences will mind half the pleasure of giant monster movies is allowing our suspension of disbelief to buckle like a bridge in Godzilla's path. And true to form, the film saves a few gonzo twists, including one especially outlandish bonus mutation for the grand finale and extended set piece in which the three creatures converge on Chicago, which has typically gotten off easy where natural disasters are concerned. However derivative it may be, Rampage knows its audience, namely Transformers fans and kids born after 9/1, for whom elaborately orchestrated scenes of falling skyscrapers carry near a whiff of real-world trauma. It's a lot harder to stomach for those who can remember the smell that permeated lower Manhattan after the Twin Towers collapsed. What director Peyton lacks in artistic vision, he compensates for in his ability to wrangle such a CG-intensive production, which is more than can be said for such WB favorites as David Yates, The Legend of Tarzan, and Zack Snyder Justice League. Unlike those filmmakers, Peyton delivers a unified-looking whole in which the visual effects integrate well with stage and location work. George, the rapidly growing high-progressive Gilla, poses a unique challenge, since he needs to appear sensitive enough for Davis to try saving. Sure enough, the folks at Weta Digital do wonders in imbuing the virtual character with an empathetic personality, making it tough to watch as the U.S. military uses every resource at its disposal to subdue the beast special. Credit to the creature designers who find a stunningly fresh way of evolving all three species. Peyton's strategy is to match grand-scale mayhem with comparably oversized human personalities, while Johnson naturally holds his own. The rest of the cast must exaggerate their performances to keep up. By far the most outrageous is Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who grandstands a la Wildey, Robert Downey Jr. as a goon from an unnamed government agency who fancies himself some kind of renegade cowboy. Somehow, together with Harris, this trio have to take down the monsters, though it's not at all clear what can stop these virtually indestructible creatures. The trick here is making audiences care about what becomes of George. Remember, Disney did it with Wreck-It Ralph after 85 years of King Kong movies have all but cemented the cliches the Rampage arcade game set out to smash, inspired by. The classic arcade game name of the same name, Rampage, is utterly ridiculous campy, yet also self-aware enough to be kind of sort of dumb fun. It's exactly the mindless, formulaic romp it's been sold, as with star Dwayne Johnson trying to carry the whole thing on his charm, but even The Rock can only do so much when a movie is this absurd after an insanely awful genetic editing formula is accidentally unleashed. Three wild animals are transformed into giant mutants who go on a yes rampage. It's then up to Ape Whisper Davis Accoy Johnson to save his animal buddy, the city of Chicago, and the day Rampage boasts a stone-cold stupid script, laden with some hilariously on-the-nose and cringeworthy dialogue, especially when it comes to all the pseudo-science involved in turning everyday animals into giant monsters. This thankless task is mostly left to Naomie Harris to deliver the Oscar nominee's very presence classes up her stock character, Dr. Kate Caldwell, enough that I hope whatever houseboat Harris did this paycheck movie for is as big as one of the giant monsters she's stuck explaining. If the internet joke is that the Fast and Furious movies were written by a 5-year-old boy, then Rampage feels like it was written by this same kid at age 10. He's developed a few more nuanced thoughts, but it's all still basically boom smash broom rampage as this. Generations cue the winged serpent, yet it's still not even as thoughtful as that cheesy old giant monster cult. Classic Dwayne Johnson anchors the film with his requisite mix of self-effacing humor, machismo, and heart. His character is a ludicrously over-credentialed badass, a former Special Forces soldier turned anti-poaching operative, turned primatologist. Davis can handle guns, apes helicopters, sleeper holds sign language, you name it, because he's The Rock, so of course he bloody can. Johnson clearly knows how insipid the whole thing is and owns it, lending the preceding some tiny dose of emotional sincerity. The bond between George the AL Dino Ape and Davis is the heart of the film. It's all very sweet, but George is already PRN, naturally intelligent and emotional before his accidental transformation. This makes the formula's effect on him seem more like roid rage than the horrific evolution that befalls the wolf and the crocodile. George ultimately seems more human than most of the human characters in Rampage, which is probably the point, but it doesn't do much to convince you the movie needed most of them. Then, speaking of which, in addition to Naomie Harris, the cast also includes Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who is essentially playing Agent Negan. Morgan delivers all his lines with the exact same cadence, draw, and swagger as his Walking Dead villain, except Agent Harvey Russell is not as much of a bad guy. Joe Manganiello also pops up as Burke the Merc, a small, one-note role that never registers the way the filmmakers probably thought it might. P.J. Bion and Jack Quaid are set up early on as Johnson's comic relief colleagues before disappearing almost entirely from the film. Even the most pedestrian of summer action blockbusters would have paid off these supporting characters later on, but that's not the case with Rampage. But of all the characters in this movie, none are as poorly served as its blazingly dumb villains whose scheme doesn't even qualify as half-baked as greedy, immoral CEO. Claire Malin Åkerman is asked to deliver bad dialogue and scowl, while a mugging Jake Lacy plays her wheezy and a equally irredeemable brother Brett. Their villainous plot makes absolutely no sense, especially when they think they can not only get away with it all, but profit handsomely from it to boot. Try as they might to shift suspicion away from themselves, there's simply no way anyone else could be responsible for all this carnage. Even a giant ape could have figured that out. On a technical level, the creature designs and visual effects by Weta are all fine, safe for the wolf, who is definitely the weakest link of the three giant monsters, while George looks real and the crocodile is scary. The wolf always looks CG animated, never quite capturing the photorealism or detail of either of the other two main beasts. Directed by Brad Peyton as a string of increasingly over-the-top action set pieces, Rampage isn't the film that will save video game movies, let alone have people start taking them seriously. Nothing here helps the genre level up, but Rampage is also exactly what it sold itself as: a big, silly, loud, dumb piece of hyperbolic escapism starring a living cartoon. No, not George. It's tough to be upset then that Rampage is as stupid and hacked as it is when it never presented itself as trying to be anything else but on that lowest level of accomplishment. Then Rampage achieves precisely what it wanted: positive elements. Rampage delivers a message about the importance of preserving life on Earth, even as the story warns against the unknown risks of monkeying around with animals. Genetic codes. Davis has the ability to connect deeply with animals, intuitively relating to them in ways that calm them. And this being the kind of action film that it is, Davis and Kate obviously put their lives on the line, as do many other minor characters, to stop the mutated monsters from tearing through skyscrapers. Humanity's goodness gets called into question at certain points, but it's obvious that heroes can still stand up against those who commit evil. The film also suggests that those who are cruel, harsh, and vindictive will eventually face justice. The value of friendship, sometimes in unlikely relational combinations, is another redemptive theme. Here, spiritual elements. Someone refers to himself as El Diablo, Spanish for the devil. Sexual content. Female characters wear tight dresses that reveal cleavage. We see a woman wearing a long shirt without pants, and her underwear is visible. A woman wears short shorts as well. George pantomimes a movement suggesting intercourse. A woman flirts with a man, suggesting by using the word submission, women often flirt, with Davis causing others to want to imitate his physical appearance. Violent content in clashes between humans and genetically modified animals. People mostly lose, humans get crushed. Structures topple, causing presumably even more unseen casualties. Buildings, vehicles, and airplanes explode as the monsters destroy them. Someone gets eaten by one of them. We see bloody attacks, animal carcasses, and dismembered human. Body parts, including a severed hand floating weightlessly in space. Human weapons, guns, tranquilizers, and bombs wreak more havoc, but often fail to yield the desired result. Dead monsters, that's cut. Due in part to the genetically modified DNA within them that enables them to regenerate health quickly and causes them to just keep growing and growing and growing. Not only do animals attack humans, but humans attack one another too. Several scenes include soldiers and civilians carrying guns and weapons of various kinds and using them against one. Another, a man gets shot and a woman is blown to pieces. Multiple scuffles involve punching and fighting. Someone refers to military personnel as killers. One painful scene, disturbingly, suggests that poachers are butchering a mother gorilla while a baby gorilla hides in terror. We only see machetes. Flying, but not their brutal impact, crude or profane language. Someone shouts an unfinished mother. We hear nearly 20 words. Jesus' name is abused 4 times, and God's name is misused 10 times, often paired with DN. There are more than 15. Uses of other profanities include biche, a whole dimmet, DN, and bards. George that. Gorilla performs crude hand gestures twice as jokes, drug, and alcohol content. Someone says, I need a drink, though. That person doesn't actually consume any alcohol. Other negative elements we hear about poachers illegally selling dead animals on the black market. A terrified man is jokingly told, check your diaper. There's a verbal gag about someone wetting himself. One main character lies to someone twice. Conclusion, if you take a trip down memory lane back to 1986, you might recall the inspiration for this popcorn flick. That year, Rampage was released as an arcade game, paying deliberately cheesy homage to monster movies, Godzilla, King Kong, etc., and it offered players the chance to digitally destroy 8-bit skyscrapers. That's basically what this movie is about, except instead of just glorying and wanting destruction, Rampage, the movie, glories in watching Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson try to save the world from those monsters, but not before we witness plenty of CGI carnage. This is a typical Dwayne Johnson movie. Buildings explode, the end of the world is near, and only one man can save the day. I'm sure you can guess who that is. The film's socially conscious messages will likely resonate with some viewers, but prompt a bit of guffaw from others given the over-extremes they're taken to hear. But the bigger issues than this film's bad movie believability include loads of violent imagery and a surprising quantity of profanity for a film you might think was supposedly aimed at family audiences. It's not really so. If you've got a hankering for experiencing Rampage, I'd suggest heading down to the local vintage arcade with a pocket full. Quarters instead, what you need to know. Rampage is inspired by the video game of the same name that was popular in the 1980s and 90s. Dwayne Johnson plays Davis, a primatologist whose best friend is George, an albino gorilla he saved in Africa from poachers. George is infected by a pathogen that makes him much bigger and hostile, so Davis must try to protect George as well as the people whom George might hurt. 2 other animals, a wolf and an alligator, are also infected and are headed toward Chicago. Rampage is terribly written, with awful dialogue and plot holes you could write a book about, if you so desired. The action is sometimes fun, but none of the actors really find their footing. Rampage has some positive moral messages about protecting people and being good stewards of animals. However, there are also some politically correct environmentalist, anti-sea capitalist, anti-human elements. The movie also contains silly caricatures of arrogant military commanders. Finally, Rampage has a slew of obscenities and profanities, plus violent and gory images. Movie Guide advises extreme caution. You will want to save your money and your time. Content, dominant worldview, and other worldview. Continent's light moral worldview of protecting people and being good stewards of nature, mitigated by strong, politically correct anti-human environmentalist sentiments and anti-capitalist elements, where the human villains are 2 capitalists, plus light anti-patriotic content aiming caricatures of the military who are depicted as incompetent boobs, foul language, more than 43 obscenities, including many words, 10 profanities, including JC and GD Man begins to say and forward multiple obscene gestures and a reference to urinating and defecating one's pants violence, strong violence. Giant rat kills scientists on a space station. Their body parts and sometimes blood float through the air. A giant and often scary wolf attacks soldiers and eats them. Bodies are ripped apart by monsters' total destruction of a city, with many people squashed or pummeled. A gorilla eats a person whole. A giant animal is impaled. Another animal's head is bitten off. Man gets battered and bruised. Fighting the monsters, a man is shot. Point Blank, etc. More detail. Rampage is a Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson starring movie inspired by the video game of the same name that was popular in the 1980s and 1990s, where giant animals wreak havoc on cities. The movie opens on a space station where a group of scientists are doing experiments and testing. Everyone on the space station is dead except for one female scientist because the experiments they were doing resulted in a rat growing in size and viciously killing everyone else. The scientist barely escapes into an ejection pod with canisters of the pathogen they were testing, but damage to the pod results in her death. The canisters enter the atmosphere and land in various parts of the United States. Meanwhile, Davis Aoy Dwayne Johnson, a primatologist and former Special Forces soldier, helps take care of the gorillas at the San Diego Wildlife Conservatory. His best friend is a rare albino gorilla named George, whom he saved from poachers in Africa and has taught to communicate through sign language. George is protective and has a twisted sense of humor, taught to him by Davis. Obviously, that night, one of the canisters from the space station lands close to George and infects him the next day. Davis sees George has grown significantly bigger and is showing signs of intense aggression, including killing a grizzly bear. What they don't know is that 2 other canisters landed in the U.S., infecting a wolf and an alligator. The owner of the pathogen is a corporation using genetic editing under the guise of researching a cure for cancer, but instead creating weapons of mass destruction. Davis is approached by a woman, Dr. Kate Caldwell, who informs him she works for the Energen, the company that created the canister, which is run by 2 siblings, Claire and Brett Wyden. In reality, Kate was fired from the company for trying to stop the Ween's evil plans before Davis and Kate are able to do anything. They're captured along with George by Harvey Russell, a government agent working for some secret agency called OGA, soon after the Wydens turn on a radio frequency from their skyscraper in Chicago that will call the 3 monsters to Chicago. Why would they do something like this? Who really knows? Since George was infected, he's grown hostile and violent, and Davis can't stop him with the 3 beasts terrorizing Chicago. Can Davis and Kate stop them before a military commander decides it's best to level the city with a bomb? The most shocking thing about Rampage is that it had 4 screenwriters who didn't see the problems with all the illogical inconsistencies in the movie. There are so many questions and disturbing fallacies surrounding the movie, it's hard to ignore them, even if you've turned your brain off while watching. For example, why should viewers feel so worried for the gorilla's life when literally thousands of people are being eaten and torn apart all around him and at his own hands? Why would an evil corporation even make giant animals when the cure for cancer is right at their fingertips and would be far more profitable for the company? How does an army commander have the authority to drop a major bomb on us metropolitan city, and how is that even a good idea? Finally, but we could continue. Why was the evil corporation doing their tests in space in the first place? Beyond. Rampage's atrocious story. The dialogue is laughable, and none of the characters really find their footing. The only upside is the movie's exciting second half, which is nonstop monster action and has some genuinely tense moments. The computer animation and Rampage is also impressive. This, however, isn't enough. Filmmakers don't have to trade a decent story for giant monsters movies like the recent King Kong thriller. Pacific Rim and Jurassic World prove that the filmmakers behind Rampage were just a bit too lazy. This film, directed by Brad Peyton, screenplay by Ryan Engle, Carlton Cuse, Ryan J. Kendall, Adam Schill, story by Ryan Engle, based on Rampage by Midway Games, produced by Brad Peyton B. Flynn, John Rickard Ham Garcia, starring Dwayne Johnson, Naomie Harris, Malin Åkerman Jake, Lacy Jeffrey Dean Morgan, cinematography Dran Prant, edited by Jim May, Bob Duck One, music by Andrew Lockington, production companies New Line Cinema Access, entertainment Dune Entertainment, Flynn Picture Company, Wrigley Pictures, ASAP. Entertainment, $7 Productions, distributed by Warner Bros. Pictures. Release dates April 4th, 2018, Microsoft Theater, April 13th, 2018, United States. Running time 107 minutes, country United States. Language English, budget 12040. Million box office 14 to 28 milli. So guys, this is the review of Rampage movie and some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting. And if you like this video, please like it, share,